All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was both the prosecution and the defense closing arguments there in the Brian Hyde case. Let's talk a little bit more about it with Joseph Scott Morgan, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. Joseph, when we're watching the defense really showing that some of this evidence doesn't link up and that the prosecution really didn't do a thorough enough job of investigating this matter, from your perspective, do you think that they made some valid arguments?
Yeah, I think that they did, Jesse. Sometimes a lot of the science, you can almost talk yourself to death and science the jury to death in many of these cases, and then suddenly the waters become very muddy, convoluted, and there's so many layers to it. He was talking about things like the hexagon test that's a presumptive blood test. He went on to talk about blood spatter.
Yeah, what did you think of that, the blood spatter? That one really interested me in the sense that if it really did have this spatter based upon the chop wounds and the stab wounds, wouldn't Mr. Hyde have more blood on him? And it didn't seem that he did.
Yeah, this would be an absolute, I hate to be too grotesque, but it would be an absolute bloodbath. I've been on many cases like this where you have multiple deaths at a scene that are either, the causality is either blunt force or sharp force injury. Right now they're thinking, the thinking is that these were chop wounds,
yeah.
Which is consistent with like machete, axe, that sort of thing. So it generates a tremendous amount of blood spatter. Counsel brings up the fact that they found no blood spatter or cast off, as he's referring to it, any higher. And it was a bit confusing the way he stated it, but any higher than about knee level, which kind of puts it in perspective that he's merely walking through the house after the fact. That if someone is raising their arms with an instrument, they're going to have, if the people at home can just imagine taking a paintbrush, dipping it in paint and throwing it over their shoulder, you're actually going to get paint on the back of your shirt or your bare back, and also in your hair many times. You'll find this consistently. And he's stating that didn't exist. Then he goes on to talk about, impugns the validity of what they're doing, that the testing wasn't thorough enough, and that there were huge gaps. He even brought in this idea of crime scene investigators early on, and I was only picking up snippets of this, talking about having shoe covers on. And that sounds very passe, but that's critical because you're talking about transfer of evidence and shoe prints and all this sort of thing. And this brings us to this idea: how many people were walking through this scene at the point? Many times at these over-the-top cases like this, everybody and their brother wants to get out there and take a look. And this is the worst possible scenario that you can have as an investigator. You want to keep the number of people that have access to the scene very, very limited, because the more people you have in there, the higher probability is that you're going to destroy some of this fragile evidence.
Of course, that's a huge danger in any case, and especially this one. I was also struck by the fact about the foreign hairs that were found on each of the victims' hands and wrists, and that he said there was a treasure trove of evidence to point it as to an alternative suspect or suspects, and they never sent it for testing. How do you explain this?
Yeah, that was kind of a head scratcher as well. You would think that in this world in which we live in, that you would want to make sure that everything is tested, and it's a legitimate question. If you're not going to test it, then why collect it?
Right.
He's talking about the nail scrapings as well and the nail clippings, and that's something that we commonly do in the morgue, where each one of the victims is part and parcel of this transfer of evidence. The hair implies that there is an intimate contact with someone that this came from, and these are big points along the continuum from the evidentiary standpoint. This physical evidence, which is the tie back in this particular case, and he's right. There is a treasure trove. And what has he done here, Jesse? Well, he's raised the specter of reasonable doubt. We'll see what prosecution will do in their closing to try to diminish what counsel has done. But I got to tell you, if I'm on this jury and I'm listening to everything, now I'm waiting. Now I'm waiting for prosecution to come forward and kind of explain some of this stuff away in closing. And I don't know that there's sufficient amount of time or verbiage to do this, because sooner or later these guys are going to start wiggling in their seats, and they will have had enough at this point in time.
Right, yeah, the prosecution delivered their closing first, then the defense, but they might want to put on a rebuttal closing based upon what we heard in the defense. We'll have to wait and see. But what I want to play for our viewers right now, and Joseph, I'm so happy you're here because this is interesting to listen about. I want to play the testimony from yesterday of Teresa Provino. She's a DNA analyst talking about everything from blood, DNA, the rape kit, sexual assault, really all of the key elements that were mentioned just now in this case. So let's listen a little bit to her testimony, and then we can break it down. Welcome back, everybody. So we are covering the Brian Hyde case. Again, this is a case of a man who's charged in a quadruple homicide, a stabbing attack, really, really brutal fashion. We heard the closing arguments by both the state and the defense, and now we're analyzing the DNA because that's really a huge component in this case. Again, I do want to let our viewers know that we're carefully monitoring the Tex McIver case out of Atlanta as well. I'm looking at the feed. As soon as we have an update, maybe the jury will come back with a verdict today. We'll talk about it. And actually, while we talk about that, I'd like to switch gears. I'm here with Joseph Scott Morgan, and he's a forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University. I'd like to just switch gears with you right now to talk about the Tex McIver case, because we didn't have an opportunity to talk about something earlier, and we'll get back into Hyde. I have a question about the conflicting reports, the conflicting testimony, between the gun expert put forward by the state and the one put forward by the defense. And the question became, what is the jury supposed to think? Was the gun definitively like this, or was it like this on Mr. McIver's lap? Because I have to tell you, when I heard Ross Gardner, who was the crime scene analyst for the defense, say definitively it is not possible that the gun was pressed up against the seat, it was not held like this, it was held on Mr. McIver's lap, I listen to that and I say, you know what? They're making an extremely strong case here.
Yeah, I felt like that Gardner really pushed this idea forward, and he described it in a manner in which I think that everybody could identify. He kind of broke it down soundly. He made this argument that that when the position of the weapon in relation to this very tiny space, and he did a great job of describing how contracted he was, even in this environment, in this rear seat. I think a lot of people at home can identify with this. You don't have a lot of freedom of movement.
Right.
And then the soot deposition on the back of the seat, which for the projectile, this was significant too. And Ross put this forward pretty well as in addition to that. Now, with the weapon, the only problem I had with Gardner's presentation was the fact that the dummy weapon he was using was a semi-automatic model or dummy weapon. And of course, this is not the type of weapon that McIver had. McIver used it was a snub-nosed .38 special revolver, which is a completely different configuration than the one that Ross had, and it's going to compromise your ability to understand this a little bit if you're the jury members, I think. But even I think the question remains: was that airweight .38, was it still? Could you manipulate it in some kind of odd angle and still keep the same trajectory that we're looking at? This thing is pitched by a certain number of degrees of deflection when you take a look at it. If he were to hold that weapon up in a standard configuration and the trigger guard is down here, it's going to throw this angle off significantly. So the only logical conclusion that Gardner was able to come to is that the weapon had to be fired either on its side like this, as was the initial contention, or it could possibly have been rotated at some odd angle so that the barrel remained in the same attitude. If you hold this thing up, Jesse, in this configuration, trigger guard down here, it's going to throw that off several degrees, and the pitch will not be the same. Neither would the soot deposition that you're going to have on the back side of the seat.
So in other words, you agree that Mr. Gardner's probably right that the gun was on the lap, but the fact that he didn't use the same type of gun in his analysis could have thrown something off a bit. But the bottom line is this still potentially an accident or a unintentional discharge?
Just looking at this, Jesse, just from the physical evidence and kind of I have to go back to this anatomically. What are the odds that you're going to score a kill shot from this perspective and from this attitude that McIver was positioned in? What are the odds if you're attempting to take the life of an individual? You might greatly maim somebody, which he initially did, and she eventually bled out, but it was a slow death. There was no guarantee she was going to die. So if you're purposed to assassinate her, as prosecution is putting forward, why would you choose this odd methodology? It's just strange to me. Well,
there's two ways to look at it, right? So the defense obviously has ample room to say, okay, listen, if he's going to kill his wife, is he going to do it in this fashion, let alone the fact that if she survives, she can make statements, which she did. She did say it was an accident, but she could have said, my husband tried to kill me. Who knows what she could have ultimately said? But the prosecution also made a good point, and I think this is key. How do we know what was going on in Tex McIver's mind minutes, seconds even before this happened? Maybe something happened where he just snapped, for lack of a better word, and wanted to fire, and maybe he didn't even want to kill her but shoot her. So that's the other argument. However, to have that situation seems maybe more unlikely than what the defense is presenting.
Yeah, it kind of does. And then you have all of these other little things that are thrown into mix. We've heard everything from alcohol to narcolepsy at this point. Well,
what do you think about that? That's a great point. I'm so glad you brought it up. What do you think about the sleep experts battling it out? Now, one expert for the defense said he suffers from a sleep disorder, while the prosecution's sleep expert said he may suffer from a sleep disorder, but it was impossible for him to fall back asleep because he said he was fearful. He said the hairs on the back of his neck were standing up. Someone couldn't enter that deep state REM sleep and therefore be startled. What did you think of that?
Well, unless Tex McIver is absent his adrenaline glands, I would think that would override any kind of narcoleptic event that he would have. The only thing I can imagine is that he would have drugs or alcohol on board that would knock him down into this deep sleep. You're talking about somebody that, initially upon presentation, Jesse, if we, think back, he's talking fight or flight at this moment in time. He's terrified. They're on Edgewood. He's asked for the weapon. He's got the weapon on his lap. And he has apparently this weapon cocked, that when you cock this weapon, it only requires 2 pounds of finger pressure in order to discharge this weapon. He's fearful for his life. Now you're going to say that you drifted off to sleep in this moment of fear. I think that it's more than a reasonable person could kind of sink their teeth into.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I want to talk about that right now. Okay, so there are things to take literally, and there are things to take figuratively, all right? So if I was the defense attorney, and you've heard them say this before, were the hairs in the back of his neck really standing up biologically, or was it more of an expression? And I'll tell you this, too. Mr. McIver didn't help himself throughout this whole case. The statements he made did not help him, particularly when he said that he is not really fond of guns or doesn't know much about guns, because we all know that he does know about guns. So here's what I'm going to say. Isn't it possible that for a man who doesn't have a problem taking out a weapon, firing weapons, very good shot, to enter into a situation where Danny Joe Carter said, oh, girls, I wish you didn't drive down here, not so much that he's terrified, but he's alert. And so he takes the gun out, not that this is a big moment. Now, if I were to take a gun out, it would be a big moment in my life. I wouldn't be falling asleep. But for him, it becomes second nature. What do you think about that?
I don't know. I guess we're talking about his comfort level, and let's think. wasn't that a dramatic moment when they wheeled all of those weapons into the court? It was striking, at that moment in time, in the face of the fact that he's saying he's not a gun guy. Level of comfort versus, his ease with a weapon, still being on alert, versus fight or flight. But all along, Jesse, they have put forth this notion that he was in fear of his life. And even the prosecution didn't do themselves any favors, because they've continued to go back to this idea where he stated the Black Lives Matter movement and dangerous area of town with homeless people and all this stuff is still resonating with the jury. I can only imagine, and they're saying, I guess that's a distinct possibility. Yeah. I think the waters are so muddy and it's so convoluted.
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with you more that the waters are muddied, and it's hard to make sense of it one way or another. Joseph, stand by. We'll talk about McIver in a little bit. We have a feedback right now in the Brian Hyde case. It's the prosecution's time for rebuttal argument in their closing, so let's listen in. You're watching the prosecution's rebuttal closing in the Brian Hyde case out of Florida. Again, I'm here with Joseph Scott Morgan. Joseph, I love this because, and look, Caroline Polisi's in my shot. Look at Caroline, what did I say? So what happened was, we were talking about this, Joseph, how we were so convinced listening to the defendant, the defense's closing argument, that now the prosecution is really laying in about the DNA evidence that they have.
Aren't they, Jesse? Right before break, or right before we went back to closing, I was making the comment that they were trying to dismantle this case by virtue of an absence of clarity, and hasn't the prosecution brought this thing back into focus relative to the forensic evidence, which is no small feat to do in a very short period of time. He kept referring back to, let's just use common sense. And as you remember, I'd stated that sometimes you can science yourself to death. Maybe he pulled back from the edge a little bit with this, because all of the science sometimes convolutes things for the jury. Sometimes it's best to get back to the simple things relative to, putting him there. He kept emphasizing the DNA on his aunt's nipple, the deposit there, and also this horrible testimony about the DNA deposits within the body of his cousin. So I think that's.
Members of the jury, I just want to remind you,
Joseph, I think we are going back to court, so here's what I'm going to do. Unfortunately, I have to sign you off. I know you have to go. It was great having you on to talk about both McIver and Hyde, so thank you very much. We can't wait to have you back on. And I am going to sign off as well. And Caroline Polisi, who couldn't wait to host, she's jumping into my shot. She is going to be your afternoon host. Let's go back live in the Hyde case.